With God, there is always more. More love, more life, more freedom. Welcome to Zoweh's Exploring More with Michael Thompson. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Our Heavenly Father has provided many delightful inns for us along our journey, but He takes great care to see that we do not mistake any of them for home." Join me and the team as we explore the kingdom together, discovering the deep truths and offering encouragement for the journey. There is always more. Welcome, friends and allies, to the Exploring More podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, hanging out with Greg Sailors and our friend Morgan Snyder, who wrote a book, Becoming a King. And this is part two, because you knew it, I knew it, and we made sure Morgan knew it. We weren't going to get through a conversation like these kingdom ingredients and pieces and discoveries. I love what you said in the first podcast about, discovery. It's not new, but it's new to me.
Yes.
And yet, we live in a culture that moves pretty quick, wants it pretty fast. People get upset if you have to wait in line more than 3 people deep.
Yeah.
Why won't they open up another register? What's the deal here?
Right.
And
they're looking for the new rather than remembering.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Chick-fil-A, times every customer.
Mm-hmm. It's their pleasure.
But they time every customer.
Right.
It's their goal to get you through in less than 90 seconds.
It's unreal. You're getting a chicken in 90 seconds, right?
Yeah.
There's something broken. You're getting a potato and a chicken in 90 seconds. Like, wait a second, someone's got to go raise it, kill it, pluck it, cook it.
Right.
Like, we accept it as normal.
Right.
And so it's so good to be with you guys, because we live this reality that isn't normal for the soul. And so we find ourselves in a world, in a habitat that's just contrary to the nature of reality. And so much of this work is being curious with God of how do we recover true life? Yeah, I love how Isaiah said it over 2,000 years ago. Isaiah 44:19, no one stops to think. No one stops to discern the times. How rare it is for someone to pause and back up and say, how do we interpret this? How do we become the kind of person, like Aldo Leopold said, that understands meat doesn't come from the grocery and heat doesn't come from the furnace? But we have lost touch with real things. And through that, we've lost touch with the actual substance that allows our souls to heal and to thrive in a world that's pretty crazy.
Right.
That's right.
Just a timeout. I applaud the podcast listeners, because to me, that's what podcast listeners do.
That's right.
They are taking some time. They might be pedaling a bike, or they might be walking, jogging, or driving, kind of back to our multitasking space, but they're doing something that they feel like, this is good for me. I need to hear a conversation, in the wildest of ways. If they're doing it right, or doing it well, I should say, they're actually a part of the conversation. It's stirring things in their hearts and minds to ponder and to consider, and maybe take those things to God. Like we said in the last podcast, even just what's the difference, right, between some regret, I wish I had done that differently, taking us to shame and the consequence of shame, versus an invitation to, Father, would you make that right in me? Would you show me? Would you give me another opportunity to turn that sadness into something that you're looking for God to provide?
Well, it's just like Jesus was talking about for a rich man, and it's easier to get through the eye of a needle, and that whole idea of the path less traveled and then the path more traveled, going to Chick-fil-A in 90 seconds, like we talked about. And we were talking about the ancient path in the last episode. I mean, what are we truly going to choose? Do we want to be the man God's designed us to be, kind of a churchy word, but do we want to become a king? Do we want to become a good husband? What are we going to do, and who's going to help us get there?
Yeah.
Greg, you just said something really important to pause. These fundamental questions of who have I become and who am I becoming? Right? Because we live in the throes of a fast world with so much flying at us that so often we're reacting. It would do us well to pause and just take inventory in the light of a loving God, to say, who have I become? Right? What's my impact on people around me? That's a really helpful exercise. Take an inventory. And who am I becoming? What is the path? Where will I be 10 years from now? Will I become more peaceful, more joyful, have more stature in my soul, more unhinged from circumstances and outcomes to bring me peace?
Sure.
Who have I become and who am I becoming? Those are just some of the fundamental questions of this journey.
Yeah, I love that about you, Morgan. I think it's one of the great things you do and have learned to do, asking questions. I think if a man can begin to implement that, I mean, it's so hard at first because we're so trained to declare, have an answer, react, respond, and do it in 90 seconds like Chick-fil-A, and get on to the next thing. But to ponder, I think the discovery process that you're talking about and what your book is inviting men into is one of powerful questions. Inventory, slowing down enough to ask some questions of the man in the mirror, of your own soul, of your own heart, of your own journey. That is a part of the ancient path.
Yeah.
It is absolutely significant in going, who have I become and who am I becoming? You don't answer that in a drive-through.
Right.
You
And you don't answer that alone.
Amen.
That's not self-discovery. We're not self-actualizing creatures. And not only does the Chick-fil-A drive-through present a view of reality that's inconsistent with the gospel. God bless Chick-fil-A, right? I eat there all the time. But the spirit of what we're after, right, is this idea that we are meant to be dependent beings. We are not the center of our story. We're meant to be united with God. Jesus was not an independent being. And you look at most of the art and whatever else you see, he's self-actualizing. He's autonomous. He's all powerful. That's not what he says about himself. He says, nothing I do apart from my Father. He says, when you see me, you see the Father, because we are one heart and one mind. And that prayer that he says, Father, I pray that these people that I love and trusted to my care, that they would become one heart with you, Father, as I am one heart with you, that they would become one mind with you, Father, as I am one mind with you. Guys, if we just pause for a moment and think about what you're facing that has your rope in a knot, what you're facing that you don't know what to do. And what if you could be and become one heart with the heart of God, one mind with the mind of God? It would change everything. And the truth is, it is available, slow and steady over time, not cheap, not quick, and not easy, but it's life and it's available to all.
Yeah. I was in Florida. My mother-in-law lives in Florida, so been down there a lot, obviously, to visit over the years, and always enjoy fishing and being on adventure and things like that. I never forget, there was this old gentleman that he loved to snook fish, and he could always catch all these big snook. And so I started just kind of migrating my heart down there on mornings, and finding some time with him. And as I was doing that, I started to learn from him and pay attention. And you can learn so much about watching, some hand over hand type stuff. So gracious in his time, and just realized, I can really learn a lot about life, not just about fishing from this man. His pace and the way that he does things, his methodical way that he does life. One of the things that he said is apropos to what you're saying is you got to put your time in.
Yes.
And I think about that with hunting, with all the other adventures that I love to do, the preparation for those adventures. You got to put your time in. And I think that's so true of going through becoming a king, in that process of becoming. If you don't put your time in, you're not becoming. You're a consumer.
Yes.
And Morgan, I think your other point was in who you're putting your time in with.
Yes, true.
Who are the people that you're entrusting, your journey, your thoughts, your heart, your beliefs? Those years with Campus Crusade with Robin and I were important. They were great. And then they gave way, to something else, as you said, and right on time, at the right time, versus, somebody who maybe started younger at the right time in their story. So there's a lot of grace in what you're saying, Morgan. There's a lot of encouragement to begin we call it orientation. I think becoming a king is so good for those who've already started. Maybe they wild at heart, or maybe they were in Heart of a Warrior, or they, been to a conference. This is a very important book in someone's journey. And if this is the book that begins their journey and they find Heart of a Warrior, they find Wild at Heart, they find Waking the Dead, they find Search and Rescue, then this is the book that starts that. There's a faculty, Tozer and Lewis and Dallas Willard. And I mean, they weren't in my world until I got to step in and experience some of John's.
Yes.
Wild at Heart. And then it was like, oh, I want to read Leanne Payne. Who is that? Yeah. Dallas Willard. I've never heard of him, and so those just became, part of the guides on the ancient path.
Yes.
And then you have these folks that you meet on the ancient path. That's a whole other, as you brought that up in the first podcast. I mean, there's other people on the path that you can journey with.
Well, and that's so important.
For a season and for a time.
It's so important to my story with my dad passing away in 1999. And I was in the church world then and coming out of the church world and bumping into Wild at Heart. I'll never forget, Morgan, I was in my office and had Wild at Heart on the shelf. A friend of mine had given me the book, and he literally pulls the book off the shelf, looks at it, and he's looking through it. And he's like, "What do you think about this book?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's a good book. Love that book."
Pants on fire.
Pants on fire. He's like, "Well, what do you think about the father wound section?" I at least had looked at the headings, and oh yeah, everybody's wounded. And he closes it back. He's like, And then I was like, curse word, why do I need to read this book? I called the guy that gave it to me. He's like, you hadn't read it yet? And then this journey started for me in that moment. Fix your eyes on Bobby Jones, in Bagger Vance,
right?
And so I started to see the field or clear the mechanism. Why do I need to read this book? And then I'm getting at this crossroad where I need a guide. And God in this ancient path brought me this guide. And so back to what we're talking about all these allies, when I started my journey with Ransomed Heart, now Wild at Heart, by the way, that's like changing McDonald's name, by the way, just FYI. It will never change with us.
For the old guard, it's hard. Yeah.
I get it. You and me both.
Oh, my Lord. But anyway.
We get packages called rancid parts, and random parts. It's messy on the inside.
Oh my goodness. But no, to the point, I mean, so many relationships. We were talking about our friend John Berquist, who just passed away, at Boot Camp Northwest. And so many of those relationships, those allies where I could go to and say, hey, Morgan Snyder, or hey, a Buzz Mayo, or, pick any number of names out there that have been in the audience at Wild at Heart. I built a career on that, honestly, of having those friends and those allies that now we get to be in this large, grand fellowship, of becoming kings and some becoming sages together or becoming warriors together. And it's been so, so meaningful to be there. So I love that, Michael.
Yeah. Yeah. Morgan, I want to press into the book a little bit more and ask you about these 5 habitats for the soul. What did you find there? What did you discover, and why was that important to share?
Yeah, there's a lot that we could unpack in that, obviously, but the book starts by recovering these big ideas of what does it mean to be entrusted with power? What is the path to becoming a son, becoming a warrior, becoming our true name, becoming a generalist? But as we flow from these big fundamental ideas of a view of reality for a wholehearted man, the plane starts getting down to 15,000 feet and then eventually to ground level. And so the chapter you're referring to is the chapter I title Becoming Good Soil. We talk about the habitat for a soul. And I think it's really important to identify every species in creation has a habitat where it thrives. And every species has other habitats where it doesn't make it. It's very hard to grow grass in Colorado, and you can pour water on it and you can spend a bunch of money, but this is semi-desert, right? And yet the ponderosa pines, they thrive in this high altitude semi-desert. We have these beautiful pines, and they don't care if it's a drought because they have a taproot that grows down deep until it finds water table that's consistent. that it can actually withstand drought. And so the question is, what is the habitat for the soul of a man to thrive and become whole, to go through the process of initiation? And just like we talked about the 90-second Chick-fil-A, we live in a world that sends messages like, the faster you can get it, the cheaper you can get it, the easier you can get it, the better it is for you. But that's not what the gospel says. And we will know it by its fruit. And so often the only two paths are humility or humiliation, but there isn't a third path. And so once a man is thirsty and has enough pain, he can begin asking questions. What is the habitat in which we thrive? And just one practical example of these ancient stones, I have to dive into Becoming a King to unpack much more of it. But as men in a broken world, we go about building. We take the God-given desire and we throw it in the service of the self. We make a little money. We make a name for ourselves. We get something going. Whatever it is we do in the name of secular work, in Christian ministry, so often our energy is get something going, make a name for ourselves, make a little money. The desire isn't bad, but what we have to do is get to the source of what is our motive and what is God after. And I am sitting with all these mentors and over 75 men for over 2 years. One of the fundamental atmospheres I believe that a man needs to thrive is, rather than building unrestrained, what if our energy changes where we actually begin to excavate, where we choose to take the lowest seat at the table and not the highest? So often, Jesus models it. We assume the highest seat at the table. But Schaeffer says the way of Christ is to say, we don't presume the high seat. We actually choose willfully the lower seat until God makes it impossible to stay there. And it's only in the lower seat that the issues surface within our soul, where we're looking for identity, where we're looking for validation, where are the parts of us that are uninitiated, that are still young as we're growing into a biological adult male, but we have these young places. And God makes it impossible to stay there because he wants to entrust us with more. Right. But to choose the lower seat is so crucifying to our ego, to our false self. No man wants to be in middle management. But I remember you guys, like early in this journey, I came to John and I had a vision for this program called Tekoa after the Band of Brothers and Georgia, the training for the 101st Airborne.
Right.
And I said, I want to train the premier warrior force for the kingdom of God. It's called Tekoa. It's a live, work, 1 year discipleship. And I put it all out to John, just waiting for him to be like, that's awesome, go for it. And he said, that's a beautiful vision. I'm going to invite you to take a lower seat if you want it. I'm going to invite you to haul the water, to carry the bags. I'm going to give you permission to be young. And I remember thinking, that's horseshit. Right. Like, to be honest, guys, forgive my language, but my soul, my ego went, wait, you're putting me on the bench? I'm made for that. I'm a warrior. I want to train warriors. I want the few. And it was God in me. It was uninitiated. It was immature. It was not on time. What was on time is serve some older kings, ask some questions, put in the miles. And I entered what was the decade of middle management. And it was so holy. It was a death to my ego. It was crucifying the false self. And what was so beautiful is in that story, when God finally put me on the platform, when he put me in front of people, when I'm out there as a public figure, I no longer wanted it.
Right.
I can tell you with all my heart, I found that I'm an introvert. I found that I'm far more comfortable off camera with a few. I found that I am no longer interested in having a public platform. And because of that, God said, and that's why you're my guy.
Yeah.
That's why I'm entrusting to your care. And I can't tell you the difference of the geography of the soul once it's healed and restored. And so that's just one of the ancient stones of how do we choose willfully the lowest seat until God makes it impossible to stay there.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Hey, we're going to take a quick break. So we'll be right back with Morgan Snyder on the Exploring More podcast as we dive deeper into becoming a good king. We'll be right back.
The Zoweh team invites you to attend the Heart of a Warrior Encounter Weekend this fall at Young Life Trail West in Buena Vista, Colorado. Thursday to Sunday, October 15 to 18, 2020. During the weekend, the team has 3 main objectives. Help a man to get his heart back, teach him how to fight, and show him where the battles are. The kingdom needs more men who know what it is to walk deeply with God and who dare to be dangerous for good. Join the Men of Zoweh by going to zoweh.org/events for more information.
Yeah. And I think for the listeners, I would say that habitat hasn't left you. That environment is still available somehow, somewhere.
Absolutely.
If you're 60 or if you're 16.
It has as much to do with a stage than an age.
Right.
It's not a biological
Right.
age. It's a stage of initiation that every man has to pass through.
Right.
It was intended to happen, a lot of it from boyhood to manhood. But all 3 of us, like most men, missed a lot of that. And the next phase it really presents is often late 20s, early 30s. But if a 60-year-old man has not gone through that process, now is the time. There's no way to become wholehearted and to become a good king without going through that process. And the other thing I would say, so much of it comes down to motive, because there might be a man saying, oh gosh, I have a big kingdom. I'm a president of a company. I'm running a church. And to be honest, I just bring my question. It's really all about my ego. And it doesn't mean that overnight you need to resign or you need to walk away from your church. What I would be curious about is, what are your motives? How do you consecrate those motives to God? And what would it look like to agree with God that you're willing to take the lowest seat in your soul on the level of motive and allow the externals to follow suit, God's time and God's way?
Yeah, that's good.
I got a new war name for Morgan, Pop Quiz.
Pop quiz?
Pop quiz. We do this around the tower all the time, and we have multiple war names. They just come and go, but just like that, it's Morgan asking questions. Here's a pop quiz.
Right.
Oh, that's so funny. I've never thought of it that way.
What does this look like to take the lower seat in the environment that you're in?
Yes.
And the goal is not to answer the question quickly. The goal is to ponder.
Yeah. Rest in it.
Rest in it and explore it, right? So I hope our listeners are feeling invited by these questions, because I am.
Yeah. My story with that, because I feel invited more, but when I was in my 20s, I wasn't allowed to be in my 20s. My dad that passed away, that was important. Had to grow up too quickly in some things with my family. Then working in churches right away as a youth pastor, education pastor, not able to be the young man, but expected to be a king, reigning and ruling well. You know, when I had my own storm of things going on in my heart, right? So then I find myself in the midst of some good kings for a little bit, some good kings that aren't so good anymore, and me trying to figure all that out and not being settled at all, egocentric. You know, we were talking about Enneagram in the last episode. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I'm an achiever, a performer, you know, and wanting to feel validated and loved.
And an applause absorber.
You know. And so, you know, when that's not going so well,
Right.
You're not going so well. If that's what it's about, and you don't have a piece of settledness.
Right.
And so the point is that I had to go back in my story of excavation and look at those places where I had to be a king too early, you know, and journey back through the warrior, journey back into the lover. And before I could get in a place now here at Zoweh and in the work that God's blessed me with to be settled enough to be that man that's a little lower on the totem pole and have people that I can entrust my heart to be that way with. And
Yes.
that's been so good. And that didn't happen at my first year here either. You know what I mean? It took some while to trust you a little better. It took a little bit of time because there was healing yet to do that had nothing to do with Michael.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what I appreciate, Morgan, about this happens in the company of others. You said that, I think, in the first part one. And I think the other thing I want you to expand on just a little bit, and the listeners, I mean, some of this, it is hard work. This, let me just be on, there's a work and an engagement to it. But if that's all you're hearing, then I want Morgan to speak just a little bit about the place of, you were talking about the 20 somethings, the younger places. Would you talk just a little bit about play and adventure in becoming a king?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. And it's funny, I just feel my heart rise up because that's essential to this process. And it often goes unseen in a warrior culture on the front end. But here's what's fascinating. So 75 men listening to their counsel. There were unique pieces, unique to their story, unique to my story. And these guys were all socioeconomic groups, geographical groups, faith differences. The number one theme of all the counsel. Okay, you think about that. These are wise guys. What's the one thing they talked about the most? It wasn't money. It wasn't God. It was play. So fascinating, you guys, the number of men. And they spoke out of regret. As I tapped into their hearts, the stories were, I wish I would have taken 2-week vacations. I wish I wouldn't have taken it all so seriously. I wish I wouldn't have taken me so seriously. I wish I would have played with my children when they were inviting me and it was just an irritation. This was so disruptive to me because I'm intense and I'm driven. And I remember in my childhood, like I had lots of joy. I remember a playful spirit. And there was one point where Sherry said to me early in our marriage, like, you've lost your smile. Like when I met you, you had a lot of joy, but like you've lost your smile. And I realized like the battle got me really serious. And people's brokenness and trauma and my own trauma, like it takes its toll. I'm 22 years into fighting for the hearts of men, and I understand a military career at 2 decades. I get that now. Yeah. It takes its toll. But I was out on a trip, and my buddy, it was a mentor I was getting to know, an older man, a big deal in a big world. He invited us over for dinner, and he's mowing his grass. And he's doing this funky, weird, circular something random. And I'm like, oh gosh, like what do we have here? Is he drunk? Like I didn't have an interpretation. He has a big sun hat on. And I went over and I said, Sam, like, I got to ask you, like, what are you doing? And he looked at me just kind of nonchalantly and he said, I'm playing. You guys, like, I'm going through the files. I got nothing. Like, what do you mean you're playing? I was so uncomfortable, right? I was so off kilter, and I'm just thinking, like, you're a big deal. Like, you're important. You have places to go. You don't have time to play, right? I'm just projecting on him everything in me, and it was revealing something. It was revealing really what I had come to believe about God and what I'd come to believe about the story. And over the years, fast forward, and there's a lot more in the book. There's some winsome pieces in the study guide. But what it revealed was the kingdom is an atmosphere of play. Like Frederick Buechner wrote a beautiful book. It's the gospel of comedy, the gospel of tragedy, and the gospel of fairy tale. He said all 3 lenses are essential to understand the gospel. A lens that we have is a gospel that God is playful. And it stems from the fact that he is profoundly abundant. He is not in a hurry. He has everything under control. And you look at creation, we have these hummingbirds that are dive bombing the flowers out in our garden. it's like, what's with a hummingbird? Like they're so strange, right? And I've been blowing my elk bugle and I'm always trying to call in other hunters in the neighborhood because season's coming up. We're getting ready for archery, and I'll blow, and I always call in a few hunters eventually. And it's just playful to just rip some bugles in the middle of suburgatory. And like these animals, like why the sounds? Like God is playful.
Yeah.
And to know him is to have the capacity to play. And my family was missing out on that. And so as I cultivate an intimacy with God, I learn by playing, it dismantles a belief that God is a drill sergeant, that life is independent, it's performance oriented. It's actually a form of repentance, and it becomes a spiritual practice that needs to be exercised with great regularity. And it is as essential to being a warrior. I heard that don't trust a man that can't dance, right? There's something in that. And it really is a doorway into the kingdom.
Yeah. There's and Greg, our team has kind of moved through the Chosen series.
Yes.
And I think it's episode 4 in that first season where it's really just Jesus with these kids.
It is.
And he's making things and showing them how to make. I mean, he's really got a 4th grade class, and it just depicts this part of Jesus that you're talking about, that he's relatable, he's kind, he has that nature of he's whimsical.
Yes.
Right. He has such funny lines for even, Simon Peter and Matthew, the tax collector. I think they did a great job of grabbing this element. If somebody, listeners, if you need to find an image of Jesus that's like that, I would encourage you to look at the Chosen, because he doesn't forsake the seriousness of his mission.
Yes.
But he includes that as a part of the seriousness of his mission. Yeah. I think he did a great job. And I'm glad you put it in your book. We'll come back with Morgan Snyder and more on the Exploring More podcast. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Exploring More. The landing page for this podcast is zoweh.org/podcast. That's ZOWEH.org/podcast, where you can find the show notes and various platforms to which we broadcast. You can also find us and the Life of More by visiting Zoweh on YouVersion Bible app, Right Now Media, our Facebook page, and Zoweh on Instagram and Twitter. Remember, with God there is always more, and you were made for more.